Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this lecture on the Great Depression, the start of the Great Depression, and Hoover's response, President Hoover's response to it. Remember, he's one of our Republican presidents during the Roaring 20s into the early 30s. Okay, we get to the causes. Many people think, as you can see down here, the stock market, Black Tuesday, October 23rd, 1929, was the date of the start of the Great Depression, which you could say it is, but there were many causes to this. One of the biggest things was there was too many goods in the United States and not enough people consuming those goods. One reason, there was this unequal distribution of wealth. Also, if there's a lot of goods, people aren't buying them, there's not as much money going about, and banks didn't have their money from those war debts they took from World War I, all the loans they gave out, and maybe more importantly to the stock market crash was the speculation on stocks, and we'll get into that a little bit. But really, consumerism, not buying enough goods, too many goods out there, prices would go really low, people weren't buying those goods, and so businesses weren't having as much success. Okay, let's talk about the stock market crash and why it was so significant. First, bankers called brokers, which are basically middlemen wanting their money back, their loans back. Brokers who had given that money to investors asked those investors to collect the money so that they could pay back their loans to the banks. However, this meant that the investors had to sell their stocks for less than what they bought them for, meaning that brokers didn't get as much money back as they should have, and investors lost all their savings because they had to sell before the price of those stocks went up. This caused banks not to get their money back, which, by the way, how banks make money is loaning people's money out and getting the interest off those. So people went to the banks in a panic, wanting their money, and banks didn't have the money to get back, which means people lost savings. Now, today, this is hard for us to think about because our deposits are insured. However, at this time, they weren't. And so, banks closed because they can't get their money back from the brokers who couldn't get all their money back from investors. And so people who had put their money into savings, into those banks, lost everything. Businesses closed because people aren't buying their goods and thus they can't pay back their loans. Workers lose their job because those businesses close and there's no money to go around to buy any consumer products. And so, as this continues, sales fall in more areas, more business shut down, and more workers lose their jobs. So this was a snowball. People wanted their money back. They couldn't. They started selling stocks at lower prices. People were freaking out, went to the banks to get their money and couldn't. It is a vicious cycle. Now, the effects of the stock market crash. Stock values drop from $87 to $19 billion. Steel production drops 80%. Industrial output drops 50%. 500,000 homes and farms are foreclosed, meaning that you can't pay back your loan, can't make loan payments. The bank takes your house and hopefully sells it to recoup some of their money. Banks also fail because they can't get their money back, which means they can't give their money. People who have savings with them can't give their savings back, and they have no money, and they are an unsuccessful business. And so 9 million people lose their savings, and unemployment goes up to 40% at the height of the Great Depression. And 1930, 4 million are unemployed. By 1932, 12 million are unemployed. 25,000 businesses fail. And work week cut, 3-to-1 layoffs. So out of 3 people, 1 is laid off. I'll let you read that, pause it and read it. But basically, our trust in our economic system and our hands-off economy and capitalism failed us at this minute. This is a run on the banks, trying to get your money back out. You can see the effects of the stock market on unemployment. We'll talk about FDR's plan to decrease unemployment, which he does a good job of, although we do hit the recession that goes up. And ultimately, what ends the Great Depression for the United States is entering a war, as wars are good for business. Now, let's talk about margin buying or buying on the speculation. This is what really, really hurt the stock market crash, and this is what we talked about with the roaring 20s and credit. Okay, so an investor wants to buy $1,000 worth of stock. They don't have $1,000, but they're willing to buy on the margin, meaning they don't have all the money, but they'll pay it back. And so the broker who borrowed that money from a bank gives the investor $900. The investor puts in $100. When things are going good, they'll sell that stock for a profit of $500, meaning you can pay back the broker his money and you make $500. However, what occurred was that people had to lose these, or had to pay the stocks back when they were less, meaning that a $1,000 stock had to be sold cheaper than it was bought for at $500, which means you need to pay back $900, but you only have $400, or you only have $500, which means that you are going to give that individual, the broker, back $500. He still is owed $400, which means he can't pay back the bank the entire part of the loan, and you're going to lose out on your $100. Okay, so speculation, the practice of making high-risk investments, getting a huge return, and buying on the margin, meaning you don't have all the money, but you're going to buy it on credit, borrow the rest for a high interest rate, meaning the broker will get a little bit extra than $900. Banks start calling in these loans. Brokers try to get their money from their investors. They have to sell the stock for less than they purchased, lose money, and go into debt. There was, at this time, no regulations on the stock market. Now, a big thing for farming is that people lost their jobs, couldn't make payments on their farm equipment, their ranches, or their homes, and thus they were foreclosed, meaning the banks will sell them trying to recoup some of their money. You get thousands of people homeless, workless, and running throughout the United States, and many will find their way to California. What you also get throughout the United States is what are going to become known as Hoovervilles or shanty towns, basically built of people moving from one place to another looking for work. They were named after President Hoover because Hoover wasn't doing anything for them. And at the same time, you get this giant environmental disaster throughout the Great Plains, including Oklahoma, because of years of misuse and extreme farming and sustained droughts. Millions of acres of farmland will become useless, and these people will have to move away, most of them to California. This will be called the Dust Bowl because there will be these giant clouds of dust. If you don't believe me, take a look at some of these pictures. Okay, and you can see where it was located. Route 66, how to get to California, Southern California. The dust coming on us. See the dust afterwards. Looks like a bunch of snow. People going to the Hoovervilles, moving out. Now, what did President Hoover do? Right, he is a Stanford grad. His first position, his first elected position was actually president. He did a lot of good things, working for the Food Administration during World War I, Secretary of Commerce before that, and runs as president. He will become our 31st president. Now, when the stock market clashes and we get Black Tuesday, Hoover blamed, he doesn't provide direct relief. The answer to why is he didn't believe that was the federal government's role. You can see a lot of what Hoover didn't do is what we're attempting to do with COVID. And we get this constraint between Democrats and Republicans right now over this. Direct relief. This would be like the stimulus checks. He believed in laissez-faire, hands-off government. He also believed in this idea of rugged individualisms, that Americans are self-sufficient and with hard work, they'd work their way out of this Great Depression. And he believed that churches, volunteers, the rich should be the ones helping each other. That's what makes America great. Now, what he does is he asks industry to pledge to keep factories open, to keep jobs, and stop slashing wages. However, they really can't. There's no money to do that. And so many businesses that had promised this early in 1930 had basically backed out by 1931. His next step, and we'll see FDR take this to the next level with his New Deal, is public works. Government-financed building projects. So the government will pay people to work, giving them jobs, giving the economy, hopefully helping it out. He also wanted mayors and governors to do this. However, many governors and mayors didn't choose to do this because they weren't willing to borrow more money or raise taxes at this time. By borrowing more money, this is called deficit spending, meaning you're spending money you don't have, which means you'll have to take loans and pay it back. This is why there's an outcry about President Biden's new COVID relief package and how much it is. It's because it's going to raise deficit spending now. But do we need it? Do we need that direct relief? So there's a lot of correlations to what's happening with COVID and our responses to the Great Depression. Okay, Hoover was totally 100% against this. He did, however, create the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is basically a government lending bank. Give money out to others. Okay, this is kind of his last gasp. $500 million. It's going to give indirect relief, meaning it's not going directly to American citizens. It's going to insurance companies, banks, other organizations, railroads, governments. Okay, it's not going to the people. Indirect. Hoover felt that by doing this, that giving them money, it would kind of trickle down to average citizens. However, many Americans saw this as basically just helping the rich get richer, while everyone else suffered. Okay? He didn't believe that it was the federal government's job to provide direct relief. This is something that's hard for us to understand, but at the time, it was kind of the status quo. This will change with FDR and the New Deal. Now, one of the big events during Hoover's presidency at the end was the Bonus Army March. It was a bunch of World War I veterans who demanded a bonus that the government had promised them. And so many were out of work, needed to feed their families, and they wanted this money now instead of waiting. And they'll set up this big camp, okay, in Washington, D.C. When Hoover asks them to leave, they don't. They refuse to leave until they get their bonus from Congress. Congress voted not to give the bonus to the veterans, and Hoover agreed, and President Hoover ordered everyone to leave. However, they disobeyed, and he's going to send in the army. It's going to be by Douglas MacArthur, the hero of World War II, later on, and he'll go in there with soldiers with bayonets and tanks to move them out. It is a bad PR scene for Hoover and will be the end of his presidency and help FDR win easily. So this did not solve the problem at all. And so with this and Hoover's lack of direct relief to the American people during the Great Depression will enter FDR, who we'll talk about in the New Deal on Monday or Tuesday next week. Have a wonderful weekend.